last session, I talked about replacement theology, this idea that God has replaced Israel with the church, and how wrong that is. It is a wicked theology and is not biblical at all in any way, shape, or form. And Paul wrote the book of Romans primarily to address the first signs of replacement theology in the church in Rome. And that's why I believe he wrote that epistle, and chapters 9, 10, and 11 specifically address that whole issue, and I recommend that you look at those chapters and read them carefully. But I want to say one more thing about replacement theology, because at its root, replacement theology is an indictment against the faithfulness of God. The idea that God can abandon his promises to one group of people in order to transfer his blessings somewhere else is the idea that God can be unfaithful, and also the idea that God is able to break his promise, deliberately choose to violate his promise so that he can get into a new relationship. This is not a picture of the God that we serve. This is not the God of Israel. It's not the God of the Bible. And replacement theology is not in the Bible, and it is an indictment against the character and nature of God himself at its root. But let's move on. Let's talk more about the faithfulness of God to Israel. You know, we see all the way through the Old Testament, there are times when God intervenes on Israel's behalf to deliver them, to save them, showing his covenant faithfulness to them. Sometimes the armies are overwhelming, and God destroys those armies. Sometimes Israel doesn't even have to fight, and those armies destroy themselves. God intervened so many miraculous times. You know, even with in the Exodus account, he opens up the Red Sea so they can walk through on dry ground, and the cloud of his presence and his glory stands between the children of Israel and the pursuing Egyptian army. But we can go on and on through Scripture and see miraculous interventions of God all the way through the Bible. But I tell you, even today in modern history, there are miracles that parallel those miracles of the Bible, and in some cases even exceed them, even do more than is even recorded in the Scripture. Because when the nation of Israel was refounded, or the state of Israel was reestablished in 1948, well, the vote was in the end of November of 1947, and then they declared their independence in 1948. That was at the beginning of a very tough road for the Jewish people, but also a road of great blessing and God's intervention. On day one, the first day that Israel declared their independence in 1948, they were surrounded by 40 million who declared war on them. And they declared war on a population at that time of about 600,000 Jewish people, without a standing army at that time. They had two small militias that ended up combining, but 40 million against 600,000, and of that 40 million, there were significant standing armies: Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, amongst others, that had capable, well-trained, and equipped armies. There was no possible way that Israel could win. But what happened? Israel won. And they had to fight, and there was loss of life, but in the end, Israel won against ridiculously overwhelming odds, once again demonstrating God's faithfulness to Israel. Let me read this verse out of Psalm 125, verse 2. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people from this time forth and forever. Let me just read that last bit again. So the Lord surrounds his people from this time forth and forever. And God surrounds his people to protect them and to deliver them from harm. And there are, as I say, there are many books and books of miraculous testimonies of miraculous interventions of God since the reestablishment of the state of Israel. But I want to go back a few years, because the first testimony I want to share with you actually takes place in 1917. This is before the modern state of Israel is reestablished, but it's at a time when the Ottoman Turks had held Jerusalem for about 400 years, in fact almost exactly 400 years, and the Egyptian expeditionary forces being led by General Allenby were coming through North Africa on their way to Israel, or the land, actually they were on their way to Palestine as it was called at that time. This was in 1917. And as General Allenby, as they came up into the mountains of Israel and they came up near Jerusalem, Allenby, who was a strong Christian believer, was concerned about the shedding of blood in the city of Jerusalem, because he recognized that from Scripture Jerusalem was to be a holy place that belonged to God, and he was concerned about the shedding of blood there. So he prayed, and after he prayed, he read this Bible passage out of Isaiah 31 verses 4 and 5. Let me read you the words. "For thus has the Lord spoken to me, like as the lion and the young lion roaring on his prey when a multitude of shepherds is called forth against him. He will not be afraid of their voice, nor abase himself for the noise of them. So shall the Lord of hosts come down to fight on Mount Zion, and for the hill thereof. As birds flying, so the Lord of hosts will defend Jerusalem. Defending also he will deliver it, and passing over he will preserve it." Interesting passage that he reads. And he noticed that this prophecy alluded to a lion, and being from England, the general knew the emblem of the British Empire was a lion, so Isaiah predicted God would fight for Zion as a lion. Well, we know that the lion is also a representative of the Lion of Judah, which is Jesus, but nonetheless, he then observed how the battle would be won, by birds flying. Now here, I think is one of the most amusing stories of God's supernatural intervention. The general decided to fly small scout planes over Jerusalem and drop notes in Arabic, little paper leaflets printed in Arabic, instructing the Turks to surrender Jerusalem. Having never seen an aeroplane, many of the Turks became fearful. They read the pieces of paper dropping from the planes and paid special attention to the name at the bottom. The order to surrender was signed by Allenby. And this is amazing. The name Allenby, when written in Arabic, is almost identical to, in fact is identical to, Allah Nabi. And Allah Nabi in Arabic means the prophet of Allah. Needless to say, the Turks gave up Jerusalem without firing a single shot, and the British took control of the Holy City in 1917, where they occupied it until Israel's independence in 1948. So, even at that time, who could have known except God that it would be General Allenby that would come up to deliver the city of Jerusalem out of the hands of the Ottoman Empire, as the Ottoman Empire came to an end? Only God knew that. And God knew that by putting his name and writing his name in Arabic, it would read to the Turks there, the Ottoman people, that it was the prophet of Allah that was telling them to surrender the city of Jerusalem. Let's turn over to a passage in Deuteronomy, chapter 20. And I just want to read 4 verses out of Deuteronomy 20. "When you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, who brought you up from the land of Egypt, is with you. When you are approaching the battle, the priest shall come near and speak to the people. He shall say to them, 'Hear, O Israel, you are approaching the battle against your enemies today. Do not be faint-hearted. Do not be afraid or panic or tremble before them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to save you.'" What a glorious statement of promise. And how interesting that it was the it was the priests who make this declaration. Don't be afraid, but know that the Lord goes before you to fight for you. I want to share another testimony. There are so many stories regarding the modern state of Israel and God's supernatural intervention, but I just want to share this one. And this was regarding not the war in 1948, but there was another war that followed later in 1973. It's referred to as the Yom Kippur War because the nations that surrounded Israel decided to attack Israel on the holiest day, on Yom Kippur. That's the Day of Atonement, the 10th day of the 7th month in the biblical calendar. Let me read you this. Michael Greenspan, a documentary filmmaker, recounts the story of a group of Israeli soldiers in the Golan, that's up in the northeast corner of Israel, carefully making their way to nearby villages on a cloudless October night. Suddenly, the soldiers find themselves in the middle of a minefield. As the soldiers begin to poke around with their bayonets trying to locate the mines, a strange wind suddenly appears. This wind was so strong that it blew away 18 inches of topsoil from the minefield, exposing over 1,000 mines. As soon as the mines were exposed, the wind ceased, and the men walked out of the field to a moonlit night. Isn't that amazing? They were caught in a minefield, mines that had been set there by the Syrian army. The wind comes and is so strong that it blows away 18 inches of topsoil. So all that was left was these mines sticking up all around, 1,000 of them. Over 1,000. And then the clouds went away and the moonlight is shining down brightly over them. And they can see where they're going. They can see where all the mines are. And they're able to walk straight through without any difficulty. You see, God watches over Israel. Even the modern state of Israel, God is continuing to show His faithfulness to them because He is a covenant-keeping God. That is something really important for us. When you and I get ourselves into difficulty, or we find ourselves in a difficult or impossible situation like that, we're in a minefield and we don't know where the mines are and we can't see because it's night. Who knows what God might do? Maybe He'll send a wind along to open up a way for us. God, we know, is a God who makes a way where there is no way. And that's what He does for His covenant people. If we understand God's covenant commitment to Israel, we will begin to understand God's covenant commitment to us, because we also enjoy covenant. That's all we have for today. Stay tuned. There's a lot more to talk about with regard to the significance and importance of Israel.